Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents A Place in History, the biography of John C. Kendrew, by Paul M. Wassarman, narrated by Jonathan Cowley. Preface. This is a biography of Sir John Cowdrey Kendrew from his birth in Oxford on Saturday, March 24th, 1917, to his death in Cambridge on Saturday, August 23rd, 1997. In research begun in 1946, as a 29-year-old research student at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge and continued independently into the early 1960s, John was the first to determine the three-dimensional structure of a protein at atomic resolution using X-ray crystallographic methods. Low and high-resolution structures of myoglobin, a protein found in abundance in muscle tissue of all vertebrates, were solved in 1957 and 1959, and published in the journal Nature in 1958 and 1960 respectively. John's tremendous achievements demonstrated at long last that proteins were not aggregates of small molecules, but were true macromolecules, and their structures could be solved by X-ray crystallographic methods. For the first time, one could visualize predicted structural features of proteins, such as alpha helices, in some detail. It was not until 5 years later, in 1965, that a high-resolution structure of a second protein, the enzyme lysozyme, was published, and not until the late 1960s that several other high-resolution structures of proteins, including hemoglobin, became available. It should be remembered that John was nulli secundus, second to none, having determined a high-resolution structure for myoglobin in 1959. Having solved the three-dimensional structure of myoglobin, an accomplishment worthy of a share of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962, John began an odyssey away from the life of a bench scientist to that of an organizer, administrator, and promoter of science on an international scale. He became a central figure in the evolution and spread of molecular biology in Europe and America during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and left behind a rich legacy matched by few others, even other Nobel laureates. In 1958, John founded the Journal of Molecular Biology and served as its editor-in-chief for nearly 30 years. The journal drew articles from the best investigators in a rapidly emerging field of research and is still published today, 60 years later. At about the same time, John became a part-time consultant to the British Ministry of Defence, which led to other governmental appointments and eventually to a knighthood in 1974. From his early 40s into his late 70s, John took on numerous national and international leadership roles that allowed him to serve as a positive force for science, especially for European science. Among other national and international activities, John doggedly pursued the goal of creating an international laboratory of molecular biology in Europe. This goal was finally realized with establishment of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, EMBL, in Heidelberg, Germany, but only after more than a decade of John's tireless efforts and relentless diplomacy. Max Perutz pointed out that Kendrew became the moving spirit in the founding of EMBL, which would never have come into being but for his drive and shrewd diplomacy. John was appointed the first Director General of EMBL in 1974 and served in that capacity until 1982, when he became the 33rd President of St. John's College, Oxford. In 1987, John retired to the Old Guildhall, his home in Linton, and he died in Cambridge 10 years later in 1997 at the age of 80. There is a widely held belief that scientists do not make particularly good subjects for biographies. Erwin Chargaff felt that many scientists led monotonous and uneventful lives, and Peter Medawar concluded that the lives of academics, considered as lives, almost always make dull reading. On the other hand, science writer and biographer Thomas Hager believes that The lives of scientists and effects science has on our world are much more nuanced, complex, interesting, and far more important, often in unexpected ways, than most people realize. John's life was neither monotonous nor uneventful, and his legacy continues to be recognized today by research scientists and major institutions. In this biography, certain aspects of John's early life are described. We see him as an only child brought up from the age of 4 without a mother by a rather difficult father, as a schoolboy at Dragon School and Clifton College, as an undergraduate at Cambridge University, and as a scientific advisor in Britain, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia during World War II, WW2. It was not until he was a teenager that John reunited with his mother, who was by then a well-known Italian art historian living in Florence. It was during the war that John worked in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, with John Desmond Bernal, an eminent crystallographer who would significantly affect the direction of John's post-war career. Also during the war, John met and fell in love with Shoshana Suzy Ambash in Cairo and seriously considered marriage to her and conversion to Judaism. In 1948, he married Elizabeth Gorvin Jarvie, a medical student and widow of John's close friend, John Jarvie, who was killed tragically in World War II. They divorced in 1956, and John remained a bachelor for the rest of his life, but had relationships with a number of women until his death in 1997. These aspects of John's life, in particular, molded his personality, influenced his decision to become a scientist, and affected the course of his professional career and his personal relationships. Although science and technology always played principal roles in John's life, his love of the arts, including classical music, literature, painting, photography, architecture, and archaeology were his passions and enriched his life. For John it can truly be said that scientia sine ars nihil est, science without art is nothing. Following John's death in August 1997, memorials were held in Cambridge and Oxford, and obituaries appeared worldwide in newspapers and scientific journals. However, the only substantial published attempt at John's biography was written in 2001 by Ken Holmes for the biographical memoirs of Fellows of the Royal Society. This is a thoughtful summary of John's career and offers keen insight into his background and contributions to science and society. Ken and his wife Mary knew John for 40 years in Cambridge and Heidelberg, and thought of him as a much-appreciated older brother for whom they had a deep affection. Ken Holmes also hosted a long, in-depth interview with John in Cambridge on Wednesday, June 18, 1997, just 2 months before John died. Why didn't John write his autobiography? According to some, John considered it, but concluded that too many autobiographies and biographies of scientists had already appeared. There was no need for another. When I asked a colleague of John's whether he would approve of my writing his biography, the answer was a definite no. Why not, I asked. Because John didn't do it himself, was the answer. I strongly suspect that John's intention to keep his personal life private may have been an even stronger motive for not writing his autobiography. Apparently, he requested that his personal diaries and letters be destroyed following his death. This was a decision similar to that of the great German naturalist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt, 1769 to 1859, who burned or destroyed many of his letters in order to keep his personal life very private. John was always very reluctant to speak or write about his private life, and he turned down several requests to do so. On the other hand, he left his very extensive archives to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, possibly anticipating that someday following his death, someone would wish to write his biography. Perhaps John would be surprised to learn that biographies or autobiographies of several of his colleagues and friends have been written since his death in 1997. For example, books on the lives of John Desmond Bernal, F. Aframian and B. Swan, 1999, A. Brown, 2007. Lawrence Bragg, G. K. Hunter, 2004, J. Jenkin, 2008. Sidney Brenner, S. Brenner and L. Wolpert, 2001. E. C. Friedberg, 2010. Francis Crick, M. Ridley, 2006. R. Olby, 2009. Dorothy Hodgkin, G. Ferry, 1998. Aaron Klug, K. C. Holmes, 2017. Max Perutz, M. Patalini, 2006. G. Ferry, 2007. Fred Sanger, G. G. Brownlee, 2014. Maurice Wilkins, M. Wilkins, 2005. And Solly Zuckerman, J. Payton, 2001. There is also a large amount of biographical material from Jim Watson dating as far back as 1968 in The Double Helix, a personal account of the discovery of the structure of DNA, and as recent as 2002 in Genes, Girls and Gamov, After the Double Helix, in both of which John plays a significant role. Watson came to Cambridge to work with John as a postdoctoral fellow at the Cavendish in the early 1950s. John also is a prominent figure in Max Perutz and the Secret of Life, G. Ferry, 2007, Designs for Life, Molecular Biology After World War II, S. de Chadarevien, 2002, A Nobel Fellow on Every Floor, J. Finch, 2008, and A Sense of Purpose, Recollections, S. Eban, 2008. In 1992, A Little Ancient History appeared in the journal Protein Science, in which Richard Dickerson reminisced about his time as a postdoctoral fellow with John in the late 1950s, working on the high-resolution structure of myoglobin at the Cavendish. In 2009, the Journal of Molecular Biology celebrated 50 years of protein structure determination by publishing 3 semi-biographical articles by Richard Dickerson, Bror Strandberg, and Michael Rossman, in each of which John plays a major role. Like Dickerson, Strandberg also worked with John in the late 1950s, and Rossman was present at the Cavendish at the same time, working with Max Perutz on the structure of hemoglobin. In 2017, the Journal of Molecular Biology celebrated the 100th anniversary of John Kendrew's birth by publishing a special issue titled Marking the Milestones in Structural Biology. A brief biography of John titled A Personal Perspective, My 4 Encounters with John Kendrew, by this author appeared in the special issue. Wherever possible, John's own words from his notes, correspondence, interviews, speeches, and publications have been included in this biography, since they reveal a great deal about him. Reading John's own words often provides considerable insight into his intellect, character traits, and personality. It should be noted that this biography is intended for a general audience interested in John's life and legacy, but possessing a limited background in science. The physics, mathematics, and technical jargon associated with X-ray diffraction and protein crystallography have been minimized here as much as possible. This biography is bound to have some errors, omissions, and other faults for which the author takes sole responsibility. Despite the inevitable faults, it is hoped that listeners will gather enough information about John Kendrew's life and legacy to draw their own conclusions about the man and his contributions. 1. Introduction to John Kendrew. I did not want to continue churning out structures, so I moved into the politics of science. John Kendrew. Personal recollections. Fresh from graduate studies in biochemistry at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, I travelled with my wife and 3 children from Boston to Cambridge, England, in the summer of 1967. It was the first time any of us had been on an airplane or abroad. I was to begin research as a Helen Hay Whitney Foundation postdoctoral fellow in the Division of Structural Studies at the Medical Research Council, MRC, Laboratory of Molecular Biology, LMB, on Hills Road in Cambridge. Trained in enzymology and protein chemistry in the Graduate Department of Biochemistry at Brandeis, my PhD supervisor, Nathan O. Kaplan, 1917 to 1986, advised me to get some experience in protein crystallography if I planned to continue my career as a protein chemist. We felt that the very best place to gain this experience in the late 1960s was at the LMB, where X-ray crystallography and other experimental approaches to determining protein structure flourished. My sponsor at the LMB was John C. Kendrew, Deputy Chairman of the LMB Governing Board and Head of the Division of Structural Studies. Max Perutz, 1914 to 2002, was Chairman of the LMB Governing Board, and in addition to John and Max, the Division of Structural Studies senior staff included David Blow, 1931 to 2004, Hugh Huxley, 1924 to 2013, and Aaron Klug, 1926 to 2018. John had solved the three-dimensional structure of the protein myoglobin by X-ray crystallographic methods in 1957, and shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry with his colleague Max Perutz in 1962. Under John's sponsorship, I was to work with his close colleague Herman Watson, 1933 to 1994, on the three-dimensional structure of the glycolytic enzyme glyceraldehyde phosphate dehydrogenase, isolated and crystallized from lobster muscle. Herman, who joined John in the late 1950s to work on the high-resolution structure of myoglobin, had been on sabbatical leave in the Graduate Department of Biochemistry at Brandeis while I was a third-year graduate student there. I attended several of Herman's lectures on X-ray crystallography and protein structure, and we got to know each other quite well during his stay. Since I had worked with dehydrogenases as a graduate student, Herman suggested that I try to extend the X-ray crystallographic work on glyceraldehyde phosphate dehydrogenase carried out at the LMB by Len Banaszak, born 1934, a former postdoctoral fellow with John. John was my official sponsor at the LMB. However, I must confess at the outset that we had very little contact during my time in Cambridge. In fact, shortly after arriving there, I learned that he was rarely to be found at the LMB, such that meetings not involving him were often held in his so-called vacant office. John himself estimated that he passed through London Airport once every 10 days or so. An American postdoctoral fellow with John in the early 1960s recalled that even then John was away from the LMB most of the time, and another fellow in the late 1960s recalled seeing John in the corridor only once or twice. One of John's research students in the mid to late 1960s claimed that he rarely had a word with John, not even a good morning. From about 1962 onward, John was rarely to be seen in the LMB's canteen, a place where nearly everyone else congregated on a regular basis for coffee, lunch, tea, and far more important than the food and drink, for conversation. John was rarely, if ever, seen at seminars, parties, or other events during my years at the LMB. However, I do remember him making a surprise appearance one day when the British Broadcasting Company, BBC, arrived to produce a short film about his research on myoglobin. At the time, Herman Watson had to help him search for some sperm whale and sturgeon mussel in the freezer for the film. John did not know where the freezer was located. As I understood it in 1967, John spent 2 to 3 days each week serving on government committees in London, such as the Defence Scientific Advisory Council and Council for Scientific Policy. In addition, he devoted considerable time serving as a Fellow and Director of Studies at Peterhouse, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Molecular Biology, JMB, an officer of the European Molecular Biology Organization, EMBO, and its conference, EMBC, and as a vigorous campaigner for establishment of an international molecular biology laboratory. Although John was head of the Division of Structural Studies at the time, apparently the day-to-day operation of the division was left in the hands of his colleagues, David Blow, Hugh Huxley, and Aaron Klug, and a Structural Studies Committee that met monthly. John's administrative assistant, Susan Coombs-Hess, managed his office matters at the LMB, and John's remaining but greatly diminished research interests were overseen by Herman Watson, with whom I collaborated briefly until he moved to Bristol University in the summer of 1968. Soon after my arrival at the LMB, John invited me to his office for what he called a chat. I don't remember much about our conversation, other than John doing most of the chatting. He was polite, formal, and slightly imposing, and I was very ill at ease. To this day I still think of John as being well over 6 feet tall, although now I know he was about 5 feet 10 inches in height. I do remember being taken aback when John told me that his salary from the MRC was only about £1,600, about $3,850 more than I was earning with my Helen Hay Whitney Fellowship. I learned much later that John's MRC salary in 1967 was about £5,000, about $12,000. At the time, the average annual income in England was about £1,400, about $3,360. I was very surprised at the small difference in our salaries. After all, John was the deputy chairman of the LMB, head of the Division of Structural Studies, and a Nobel laureate. I was even more surprised that he would tell me about it. John ended our visit by telling me how much he enjoyed talking to me, and that we would get together to talk again soon. We did meet again in his office for a brief chat, but not until another year had passed. As I recall, our second meeting and our last in Cambridge was much like the first. We never discussed my research at the LMB, science in general, or anything else of particular importance that I can remember. When I left Cambridge for the United States, it was without a goodbye from John. He was away. More than 20 years later, I was attending a meeting in Israel and had the opportunity to meet John, now Sir John, once again. He had been retired for several years and was living in Linton near Cambridge after leaving as Director General, DG of EMBL Heidelberg, and then as President of St. John's College, Oxford. At a cocktail party in Jerusalem, Aaron Klug told me that John was attending the party, had been quite ill, and the prognosis was not good. Aaron strongly suggested that since I was so grateful to John for sponsoring my postdoctoral time in Cambridge, that I take the opportunity to thank him in person. Reluctantly, I searched for John and found him by himself outside on a balcony. I introduced myself. It was unclear whether or not he remembered me, and told him how much I appreciated his invitation to join the LMB, how very much I valued my time there, and that it was one of the most memorable periods of my professional life. To my great surprise, John became very emotional, his eyes filled with tears, and he thanked me effusively for telling him how I felt. At the time I thought his reaction uncharacteristic, certainly unexpected, and our conversation was short. However, I am extremely grateful for having had our third, and what proved to be our final chat. Our meeting in Jerusalem has remained a vivid memory during the intervening years. John died in Cambridge 6 years later, at the age of 80. Molecular biology. Much of this biography deals with molecular biology, a discipline that began to flourish in the 1950s, due in part to publication of the structure of deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick, founding of the Molecular Biology Research Unit at the Cavendish Laboratory by John and Max in 1956, John's three-dimensional structure of myoglobin in 1957, and founding of J&B by John and Academic Press in 1958. John discussed the origin and meaning of the term molecular biology in the Encyclopedia of Molecular Biology, a comprehensive volume of nearly 1,200 pages he edited in 1994 while in retirement. The term molecular biology seems first to have been used by Warren Weaver in his 1938 report to the Rockefeller Foundation. Astbury used the term a year later, in 1939, and it became increasingly common as time went on. It was apparently first used in the name of an institution in 1956, for the Medical Research Council Laboratory of Molecular Biology at Cambridge, in that of a journal in 1959, the Journal of Molecular Biology, in that of an international organization in 1963, the European Molecular Biology Organization, and in that of an encyclopedia in the present volume. There have been many attempts to formulate an adequate definition of molecular biology, many of them of course reflecting the intellectual preoccupation of their authors. Thus Erwin Chargaff wrote of it as the practice of biochemistry without a license, a definition ironically intended, but which did indicate that its devotees in the early days were generally trained in other fields. Indeed, few of the early molecular biologists were brought up as biologists. Most were chemists or physicists. Perhaps the most satisfactory brief definition is that of Jacques Monod. What is new in molecular biology is the recognition that the essential properties of living things could be interpreted in terms of the structures of their molecules. At the beginning there were two schools of molecular biology. The first comprised those primarily interested in the three-dimensional structure, or conformation, of biologically important macromolecules, especially the proteins, and whose technique of choice was X-ray crystallography. Early practitioners were Astbury, Bernal, and Pauling. Perhaps the first experiment in molecular biology was Astbury's demonstration in 1929 that the X-ray pattern, and therefore the structure of a human hair, changed when it was stretched. Then, a little later, came those interested in biological information and its replication. These made up what may be called the one-dimensional school. Early practitioners were Delbruck and Luria. The two schools, which at first had rather little to do with one another, began to have active connections in the early 1950s, when it became clear that DNA was the genetic material, and when one of those trained in the informational school, Watson, came to the Cambridge Laboratory, which was the centre of the conformational school, and worked with Crick on the structure of DNA. Since that time, the two schools have become intimately intertwined with one another and with other fields. And today, the boundaries between biochemistry, genetics, molecular biology, and biophysics have become less and less well defined. Laboratory of Molecular Biology. The MRC unit for research on the molecular structure of biological systems was founded in 1947 at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge with only two members, Max Perutz and John Kendrew, the former director, the latter a research student. 1 year later the unit doubled in size to 4 members, Max, John, Francis Crick and Hugh Huxley. The latter two also research students, Crick with Max, and Huxley supervised by John, who was himself still a research student. The name of the unit was changed to the Molecular Biology Research Unit in 1956, and John, who received a PhD in 1949 at age 32, became its deputy director 8 years later in 1957. In 1962, members of the unit at the Cavendish, as well as other scientists from Cambridge and London, including Hugh Huxley, Aaron Klug, and Fred Sanger, 1918 to 2013, moved into a newly constructed building, the MRC LMB, at the Addenbrooke's Hospital site on Hills Road, Cambridge. Max and John became chairman and deputy chairman respectively of the new laboratory. John was also appointed head of the Division of Structural Studies and the two other divisions, Molecular Genetics.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?